Once again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am very pleased to welcome author and writer and many other things, Robin Clifford Wood. She is here tonight to be talking about her new book, The Field House. She's going to be telling us a little bit about her experience living in Rachel Field's home on Sutton Island. Now, Rachel Field was a National Book Award winning novelist and a Newbery Medal winner. And she was very popular during her day, but she kind of fell off the scene a little bit. And so Robin's going to fill us in on her story and again, the experience of living in her home. So let me tell you a little bit about Robin Clifford Wood before we begin. She is an author, a poet, a blogger, and an essayist. She has a Bachelor of Arts from Yale and a Master's in English from the University of Rochester, and a Master's of Fine Art in Creative Writing from the University of Southern Maine's Stone Coast program. Wood's writing has been featured in Port City Life magazine, Bangor Metro, Bangor Daily News, Maine Public Radio's Music That Moves Me series, and Solstice Literary Magazine, which published her essay, How Do You Help Your Parents Die, in 2019. One of her poems, The Ballad of Hadlock, the Seal Showman, was produced by Penobscot Theatre Company as part of their Fall 2020 audio theater program. She's a fascinating lady, and I look forward to hearing this talk. So without further ado, I would like to turn the program over to Robin Clifford Wood. Thank you for joining us.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you so much to all of you for coming. I was very excited when a friend of mine recently sent me a photograph of the stone carvings in the yard outside the Camden Library that have books carved as the legs of the benches is it in a park outside the library? Is that what it is?
It's in our children's garden, which is right outside the entrance on Atlantic Avenue, if anyone wants to see that in the future.
Yeah, and there are two Rachel Field books out there, two of her Newbery Award winning, or one was the winner of a Newbery Award, and the other was a Newbery Honor book called Calico Bush, which is my favorite of her children's books. She won awards for both children's books and novels. So she was quite an accomplished woman. So let me go ahead and start by telling you, let's see, a tiny bit more about I started out wanting to be a writer when I was about 8 years old. So this was really a lifetime dream for me. And having this book come out right now, honestly, it feels a bit unreal. Even though I have been working at this for quite some time. I think I published my first article in about 1985. And I published articles very sporadically with years in between while I was raising a family of 4, pretty much a full-time mom. And I also did some of that graduate work that you heard about, sort of squeezed it in amongst my mothering years. But when I look back on it, it turned into an accumulated quite a lot of writing. And I think it took me a while to recognize that I was slowly getting there. But I think I credit Rachel Field herself with a great deal of my breaking into writing in a more serious way. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as time goes along. I wrote a column for the Bangor Daily News for about 5 years, and which was great fun. And I mostly was writing profiles of people from Maine. And in a way, this book about Rachel Field is like a very enlarged version of what I did all those years, because I was highlighting the beauty of someone's life, which is really what my goal was when I was writing those columns for the Bangor Daily News. And I did a short one about Rachel Field during those years of writing 800-word columns. So that was the beginnings of my Rachel Field connection. But let me tell you a little bit more about Rachel Field. As Julia told you, she was a National Book Award winner. She was also a Newbery Medal winner, the very first woman to win the Newbery Award, in fact, in 1930. and a Newbery Honor winner. She also, one of her books won the Caldecott Medal posthumously. That's was her poem called Prayer for a Child that was, now of course I'm forgetting the illustrator's name, and that was another addition to her, another feather in Rachel's cap posthumously. She had moved to Hollywood and had a bunch of books made into films, one of which was nominated for Best Picture in 1940. So, and by at the time she died, she had been considered, she was on a short list for the writers that were considered to be the screenwriters for Gone with the Wind. She wrote for Disney. She wrote the English lyric for one of the segments, the Ave Maria segment in Disney's Fantasia. So she was really a big deal, friends with Betty Davis and Vincent Price, and really making it big when she died quite suddenly and unexpectedly, and without a whole lot of explanations. Obituary reports said vague things like died of complications following surgery, but it wasn't very clear. And that mystery and many others were what drew me into the story of Rachel Field. There was whispers of an inappropriate marriage. There was a sister in her life who then seemed later to disappear, and was there the sister who went mad or something like that. It was just this, I heard rumors amongst the people in down East Maine, where Rachel spent her summers for 20 plus years. And that island, which is one of the Cranberry Islands off Mount Desert Island, is called Sutton Island. It was one of the 5 island archipelago of the Cranberries. And in that house that was Rachel's house for so long, I stumbled into it one day with my husband. We had been going to the island for a while because his family had been regulars on Sutton Island. It's a tiny little mile-long island, and it has no roads or utility. There are utilities now, but none when Rachel was there. I think I'm going to start by giving you a picture of this island that brought us together. So I'm going to share my screen for a moment. Bear with me. And just to give you a bit of context, I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you some pictures of this island that Rachel and I share. So this is the house that is the Field House. It has been called the Field House because Rachel Field lived there for all those years. And the people that live in the Cranberries, many people still remember her in that region. It's one of the pockets of Rachel Field fans that remains quite vibrant. In fact, when we first moved into this house, the first summer we were living in this house, which would have been 1994 when we bought it, and maybe 95 was the first summer we were actually living there, tour boats used to pass by out front and say, "To your right, you see the home of famous author Rachel Field." And so we felt like that was pretty cool. We were sitting here on this famous house. But Rachel Field, in the years since, has disappeared even more from view. And I wasn't quite sure why she was so obscure. And before I go into that more, I'm going to show you a couple more pictures of this island to give you a context. You can see that it's a different collection of houses raised up on decks. It's quite rustic. And then here are some views from out in front of the house. That's the island in October light, which is one of my favorites. And here's a silhouette of the shoreline. There's the island in the dawn light, the house looking out towards the sea. And what we're looking north towards Mount Desert, probably looking across towards Seal Harbor and Acadia National Park. We can see Cadillac Mountain from our front porch. And there's my husband, Jonathan, and my dog, Clara. hanging out on the porch. And I'll talk about some of this in a little bit. So when we first moved into the house, because it's such a tiny island and not very accessible, when people sell houses on this island, they tend to leave them as is. They don't move a lot of stuff in or out because to transport things is quite an ordeal. You either lug it in a wheelbarrow or on your back in a backpack, or you go through a very complex arrangements of bringing in barges or building ramps, and it's quite complex. So when you buy a house on Sutton Island, it's often filled with the paraphernalia that's been there since the house was built. So a lot of these things even preceded Rachel herself. But I learned of some of the things that I knew had been hers in particular. So Rachel Field always had a Scotty dog companion by her side. So there's a bunch of Scotty dog knickknacks around, including these cocktail napkins. There's a candle snuffer and an ashtray with a little metal Scotty dog on it. Here we have RLF, Rachel Lyman Field, her initials embroidered into a linen dish towel. And this key is a skeleton key that it used to go to the old kitchen. We have since had to have the locks changed, but that Rachel even wrote a poem about this key called The Playhouse Key with an illustration of it in one of her books of poetry. And there's a young cousin of mine sleeping in this old sleigh bed that Rachel Field slept in one of the rooms of the house. And there's another shore scene with another cousin. And I'm going to stop here. This is my children and a bunch of their island friends and cousins putting on a play on Sutton Island, which was quite appropriate because, how many years earlier would it have been? In about 1918, Rachel Field directed one of her own plays on the island with a bunch of island children. And I didn't know that when my kids were putting on these plays in the middle of the forest for Sutton Islanders. So that was a pretty cool thing to find out that Rachel Field and I had in common. All right, so I'm going to try to, let's see. I'm going to stop sharing now and come back to you. All right. Okay, so that is the field house. You've gotten a little picture of it. Rachel Field bought it in 1922. It was built in about 1898. Rachel bought it from the original owners in 1922. I bought it in 1994. And I had never heard of Rachel Field when I first set foot in that house. I knew that she was a famous writer, and that's about as much as I knew, except there was one thing I did know, and that was a particular poem that was very appropriate for the setting. There's a poem some of you may have heard of. It's called If Once You Have Slept on an Island. And I'm going to recite it for you. If once you have slept on an island, you'll never be quite the same. You may look as you looked the day before and go by the same old name. You may bustle about in street and shop. You may sit at home and sew, but you'll see blue water and wheeling gulls wherever your feet may go. You may chat with your neighbors of this and that and close to your fire keep, but you'll hear ship whistle and lighthouse bell and tides beat through your sleep. Oh, you won't know why and you can't say how such change upon you came, but once you have slept on an island, you'll never be quite the same. I particularly love that poem because it fits exactly the experience I had being on Sutton Island and living in the house that Rachel lived in. And I want to tell you a little story about that particular poem, because as you can see from my background, I've got a poster and the book itself. The title is The Field House, because that is what the house has been called by locals for many decades now. And that's where the title eventually came from. But all during the years that I was working on on the book, it was 9 years of writing and research and another 4 to go through the publishing process. So 13-year journey. My working title during all that time was "You'll Never Be Quite the Same." I toyed with if once you have slept on an island, but I think there's a picture book by that name already. But my publisher said to me, "You'll Never Be Quite the Same" sounds a little bit like a self-help book, and that might not sell to the audience you're looking for. So we came up with this other title, and I'm very happy about it because a writer's life lost and found on an island in Maine is more descriptive about what happens in this book. So then let me tell you a little bit about what happened to me once I started spending summers in Rachel's house. At first, I was consumed by my mothering jobs, but I started getting interested in Rachel herself. I started reading her work. I started reading her poems, which I absolutely loved. And then I read her Newbery-winning books, and then I found out about her novels and read some of those. And then I went over to Great Cranberry Island, where the Historical Society has a dedicated corner of their Cranberry House Museum dedicated to Rachel and Hitty, who is the protagonist of Rachel Field's Newbery-winning book called Hitty, Her First 100 Years. And Hitty was a doll who was carved out of wood on the Cranberry Islands by a peddler in Rachel's story, and then spent 100 years traveling the world with various different owners. And it was a very popular book, and it was actually re-released in a new form not too many years ago by Rosemary Wells, because some of Rachel's chapters were a bit dated, and so that's been a pretty long-standing popular book, and many people I've run into have deeply fond memories of reading Hitty when they were kids. So I read all these works by Rachel, and then I started looking at the Great Cranberry Island Historical Society and learning more about Rachel herself. And that's where I learned these mysteries. She married some guy, I think he was a Broadway actor, but it was late in life. She married at 40. And then there was this mystery of her sister who seemed to disappear from the family. And then they think Rachel had a child, but people weren't sure. And then they thought maybe she'd had trouble with infertility, but they weren't sure. But if she did have a daughter or a child, where is she now? No one had any idea. There was no trace of any living daughter of Rachel Field. So there was, and what did she die of? There were so many questions, and I got completely hooked with trying to solve these mysteries about Rachel Field. And that's about the time I first took on writing about Rachel, first for the Bangor Daily News, and then I pitched a story to Port City Life magazine. That was my first big glossy magazine article, was thanks to Rachel. And I started researching her life. I spent many months looking into archive collections and reading Rachel's old letters, and collected enough material to write 20 articles of the length that they wanted. And I said, oh, okay, I'll take another year and finish the whole biography in my naive way. And then I got very addicted to the research process, and off I went. So I'm going to take another little break here and read to you from the prologue of the book, because this is one of the best ways for you to get a sense of where this book takes you. In 1994, my husband and I purchased a long abandoned wood frame house on an island off the coast of Maine. In the 1920s and 30s, it had been the summer house of author Rachel Field, on the island that inspired all her most successful work, the poetry, plays, children's books, and novels that took her from struggling writer to Newbery medalist, National Book Award winner, then rising Hollywood success. At the peak of her renown, she died suddenly and unexpectedly, leaving so many stories untold, including her own. When I first walked onto the island home that had been her magical place, her muse, Some of those stories reached out tendrils looking for a place to attach themselves. I felt their presence in the flutters of my heart, but didn't know at the time what it meant. Many people know the sensation of entering an old house and feeling something of its history in the air. It whispers from the corners, buzzes indecipherably in the motes of dust illuminated by a ray of sunlight through wavy glass. The building retains some indefinable quality left behind by its former inhabitants, some of their energy lingering in the atmosphere. On an island with no roads, only footpaths and wooden wheelbarrows, the leavings of former inhabitants are not just figurative. Rachel's weighty wooden sleigh bed is still there in the room where she slept. The old wicker chairs in front of the fireplace creak under my weight as they creaked under hers. Her Scotty dog trinkets and paraphernalia wait expectantly, pointy ears on alert, on shelves and in drawers. I sit on the front porch, the covered piazza, as Rachel called it, and I contemplate the same view of Seal Harbor and Acadia National Park's Rocky Top Mountains across an expansive sea called the Eastern Way. That same view inspired Rachel's creative work, her joy, and her loneliness. Rachel's life was not easy. It was not all fairy houses and moon glow, or silver streaks of rain on city streets, or soaring gulls alighting gracefully on the barnacled rocks of an island off the coast of Maine, even though her work is alive with all those wonders. It wasn't a life of deep deprivation either. Her family had enough means to get by and the social status to be accepted into most echelons of the stratified society of her time. The difficulties in Rachel's life were more situational and internal. First, there was her physical presence. Many who knew her effervescent spirit on the page were shocked to meet Rachel in person for the first time, for she was not the elfin sprite they expected, but a woman of imposing stature and heavy masculine features. Her warmth quickly eclipsed superficial impressions. She had a lightness about her, something open and engaging that made people feel like an old friend at her kitchen table. Nevertheless, her exterior self caused her a lifetime of rue. I also sensed that her story was weighty with much deeper disappointments, even before I'd begun my research. There were shadows of loss, heartbreak, secrecy, a sister gone mad, an improper marriage, infertility, a child who seemed to disappear, so many unanswered questions. But Rachel's story, I was certain, held more than anything, a prodigious share of redemption and hopefulness. I was certain not only because of Rachel's work, but because I inhabited her space. Okay, I'm going to follow that with a couple of poems because one of Rachel's most anthologized poems, amongst her children's poetry, she wrote both children's poetry and poetry for adults, addressed this phenomenon which really probably every human being feels to a large degree, this sense that your exterior self doesn't properly reflect who you really are on the inside. This is called My Inside Self. My inside self and my outside self are different as can be. My outside self wears gingham smocks and very round is she, with freckles sprinkled on her nose and smoothly parted hair, and clumsy feet that cannot dance in heavy shoes and square. But oh, my little inside self in gown of misty rose, she dances lighter than a leaf on blithe and twinkling toes. Her hair is blowing gold, and if you chanced her face to see, you would not think she could belong to staid and sober me. So she wrote a lot of books and poems that addressed that very thing, including a children's book called Hepatica Hawks about a child who is a giantess and travels with the freak show in the circus. So and she even admitted that that was one of her most autobiographical books. So it was pretty major issue for Rachel Field. This is another charming poem because one of the things I haven't talked to you too much about yet was the other reason I got so captivated by this woman was because she's an absolutely charming spirit. I read her letters in archive collections all over the country, and letters written about her, and she delighted people. She was a stellar storyteller. She was a raconteuse. She had this very musical quality to her voice. She had been on stage as a child and a young adult, to great success. Her voice was musical and highly trained and quite beautiful. But the text of her poetry is also um, filled with delights. Not maybe sometimes she said, "I fear I tread on the sentimental," but it's wise. It's wise. It sees beauty in the ups and the downs. It's very philosophical about the human experience. And here's one called Some People, a very short poem that's one of my favorites. Isn't it strange some people make you feel so tired inside? Your thoughts begin to shrivel up like leaves all brown and dried. But when you're with some other ones, it's stranger still to find your thoughts as thick as fireflies, all shiny in your mind. So that's just to give you a little taste of Rachel Field's spirit in her poetry. All right, I'm going to move on to one of the things that also kept me going in this project. As you can imagine, in a 9-year project, I didn't spend 9 years, 8 hours a day working on this project by any stretch. Sometimes I took months off at a time, probably one time closer to a year and a half when I wasn't even working on this at all. But there were so many connections between Rachel and me beyond sharing a house on an island in Maine. The poetry, the longing to write, and the longing for motherhood, which I found was a very powerful force in Rachel's life. And I just felt like she kept getting thrown back in my path in one way or another. Every time I tried to put this project away, I got discouraged. I thought, I'm never going to get through this project, never mind. But then I'd get a phone call from someone with a private Rachel Field collection who'd found my name, or I'd get a call from an archive librarian saying, oh, someone's going to donate their Rachel Field collection. Can I give them your contact information? Someone called me because they wanted me to read Rachel Field poetry around the state of Maine for a poetry day event. A Sutton Islander flew me to Florida to speak about the writing of biography before I'd even written very much. So I got to talk about Rachel Field, and I went to a Hitty event in Stockbridge, Massachusetts to talk about my research. So every time I tried to put the book away, it got thrown back in my path. It became something that felt almost inevitable. And every time I had to go somewhere, it turned out to be a place where I needed to go anyway for my family. I had to go to California to see my daughter's softball team play. And that's when I did all my research in California. I got to visit Rachel Field's homes in California and the hospital where she died. I got to look at the ancient leather-bound medical records book with calligraphy writing for the records of the time she died. And then I had 2 children at Yale when I discovered there were huge Rachel Field archives at Yale. And I had kids living in Washington, D.C. when I found out there was a big treasure trove of things in the Library of Congress. My mother went to Vassar College, and I'd never visited there with her, but there was a Rachel Field collection at Vassar College, and I spent a rare day with my mother, who came to be my research assistant for the day. So it dovetailed with my life, my family life, and my mother life in so many uncanny ways. The most incredible one was that I had been, one of the mysteries about Rachel was that she wrote many books of poetry. These are just a few of them. One called Fear is the Thorn was a very powerful book of poetry for grown-ups, and there's clear heartbreak in there, pain, a great pain in love. And I knew that the man she married, it just didn't fit the man that she married. I couldn't find anything in the writings to or about her husband that indicated that he had been the source of this heartbreak. So that was something I revisited across years and years, and to no avail. It was a dead end. And one day, about 2 weeks before I was going to drive my daughter down to New Orleans, she was transferring to Tulane for the first time. Neither of us had ever been down there. And during that summer lull, I pulled out my Rachel Field notes once again. And I found the name Lyle Saxon. Now, I had been searching for a Lyle for years because in an old Wanamaker's diary from 1928 on the shelves of the field house, I had found 2 entries from Rachel's mother. And in August of 1928, she wrote, "Rachel and Lyle, all devotion. She has an almost maternal care of him." And I thought, who is this Lyle? I wonder who that is. That sounds like a love interest, but I couldn't find any record anywhere else. None of the letters, none of the collections. But then I stumbled upon this name of Lyle Saxon, and he was a writer about a contemporary of Rachel Field's, and he spent some time in New York City when she was there. So I contacted through email Lyle Saxon's biographers. 2 people had written his biography. And the second woman was stunned to hear from me. She said, "I can't believe you live in Rachel Field's house." I was almost going to write Rachel Field's biography because of her letter writing. She writes the most exquisite letters. I've read 30 of them, and I'm sure she was in love with Lyle Saxon. And this was so exciting in this lull of summer to find someone who knew this Lyle. And I said, maybe this is the answer to this mystery I've been looking into for years and years. And I said, oh my gosh, where are those letters? And she said, they're in the archives at Tulane University. So there I was speechless. So there I was on the threshold of driving to Tulane University in 10 days time. And my daughter and I spent some of her first few days down there reading and researching Rachel's letters of that time. So many, many things kept dragging me back into the story, and I became completely enamored of this woman in many, many ways. And as a result, as you might have read, if you read a bit about this book, the genre is called a biography memoir hybrid. It's really, I'd say 80 to 90% biography. But the memoir part came from the fact that when I gave talks about Rachel Field all around New England and in Florida and Massachusetts, I found that the thing that really captured people's imagination was when I started talking to them about the connections between Rachel and me, and how Rachel helped my writing life blossom, and how many things we had in common. But I resisted adding myself into her story. I felt this calling. I wanted to bring Rachel's light back to the world. I felt like her tragic death, and there was tragedy upon tragedy following her death, had snuffed out the light that was her life. And I thought my duty is to write this book to bring Rachel back to the world. And I didn't want to add myself to it. But eventually I gave in, but I didn't know how to do this. I didn't want to insert my voice into her story. But I got this idea from a writing prompt at a writing conference where the teacher said, write a letter to someone who will never read it. And my instant thought was to write a letter to Rachel Field. And it just poured out of me. And I thought, wow, this may be exactly what I need. And over the next year, I composed letters from me to Rachel Field to precede each chapter of the book. And in those letters, I end up tracing my story and how Rachel transformed my life and how I the journey of my discovering Rachel. And I'd like to share one of those, a part of one of those letters with you. So here's an example. Dear Rachel, 14 years after my first summer in your house, I began to get serious about getting to know you. It helped that I had become a year-round resident of the state of Maine. If you were working on getting my attention all that time, I apologize for taking so long to get around to the job. I have grown attached to the state of Maine just as you did. It is a place that loves its artists and writers, and I slowly, painstakingly slowly, found a place of belonging here as a writer. It was largely because of you that I finally broke into writing with conviction in the spring of 2008, when I bravely pitched an idea for a magazine feature to an editor at a writer's workshop in southern Maine. I told her about sharing a house with a famous Maine writer from long ago, and she was intrigued. That summer, I got the assignment to write the story for Port City Life magazine. I began researching in earnest for the article that would come out the following summer. I feel strange talking to you about what I read in your letters and journals. There are times when I wonder if I might know you better now than anyone ever knew you in life, because I read your childhood journals, your college letters, and all the stories of your evolving adult womanhood all at once. I got to spread the entire timeline of your life before me and study it. I unearthed secret chapters and put them together with the unexplained non-secret parts and tried to figure out how everything fit. But I won't go into all of that just now. So there's a little taste of what some of the letters look like. So with the minutes that we have left, I would like to share some more. I'm going to share my screen with you, and again, I'm going to show you some more pictures, and I am going to play a audio recording for you of Rachel Field on a game show, radio game show called Rise and Recite from back around 1938. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with you again. And we'll move on from the children putting on a play. There's an old picture of the house with a railing that it is no more in front of the house. I think it's been washed away. There's Rachel's Newbery Award. Here's a picture of Rachel with her dog. She has many pictures with her dog and her typewriter, her tool of choice. And I like to put this in here just so you could see an example of her handwriting, which is very expressive, loopy handwriting. This one talks about July 14th, 1922. It's reporting her decision to buy an island off the coast of Maine. And there she is with Spriggan, her first Scotty dog, on Sutton Island. I was quite taken aback when I first stumbled upon that photograph in an encyclopedia. And there I am with my dogs, just for comparison. And this was my Sutton Island, was being there with my children, reading, putting on plays in the woods, and growing up. And that dog might be the one you heard barking in the background a few minutes ago. One of my grand dogs. Here's Rachel Field, close to the time she died, probably she died in 1942, and I think this was probably in 1940, maybe 1940. And there she is with Betty Davis on the set of All This and Heaven Too, which was the film nominated for Best Picture. Rachel Field was also an illustrator, and a lot of her illustrations were these silhouette pictures. This was my next door neighbor on Sutton Island has this page in the guest book in her house, which was kind of cool. There's Rachel's signature and her sister's and her mother's and her aunt's all on that page, and Rachel's homemade silhouette illustrations. And Rachel also hooked rugs, and this is a really gorgeous hooked rug of Bear Island scene that she gave to a family on Sutton. And she made tiny little books as gifts for her friends. This was an A through Z thank you note for, it might have been for her, yes, for her editor. I believe it was for her editor. And I loved this one so much, I put this on the last page of my own book, the end of this book. Some more illustrations. And I'm just going to leave you with a couple more island scenes before I play you this audio recording. Okay. I'm going to go back to this picture of Rachel so you can look at her face while I play you Rachel's voice.
Now we have another star graduate of the Little Red Schoolhouse, one of our girls who has written one of the country's best-selling novels. I'm sure you've all read All This and Heaven Too. If you haven't, you ought to, because it's a great book. It's written by Rachel Field. Come right up here, Rachel. Good evening, my dear. We're all mighty proud of you, Rachel. Imagine you being a great writer. Little Rachel Field, who was always getting ink on her fingers. So, didn't you used to wear your hair long down your back when you were in school, or was it in pigtails?
Oh, I wore them in 2 pigtails down my back. They used to get in the ink wells on the desk in back of me.
Oh, yes, I know. Well, you grew up to be a mighty good-looking woman, Rachel, and I wish all our scholars turned out so smart. I declare I talked to one of our boys a week or 2 ago, and he didn't know any more than he did when he was in the 5th grade. I asked him some questions about literature. And my goodness, I guess they're going to make a moving picture out of your novel, Rachel, I think.
Yes, it goes into production this summer.
You're going to write it for the movies yourself?
No, I'm working on a new novel.
Oh, I see. Well, you ought to try writing for the movies, Rachel. One of our boys is doing that very thing, and he's just started at it. He's doing pretty well. In fact, he's ahead of the game. He sent in 2 manuscripts to Hollywood, and they've already sent him back 5. Well, I understand our favorite recitation, or your favorite recitation, is that beautiful poem by Eugene Field, one that is beloved by all children from 6 to 60, called A Dutch Lullaby.
Yes.
That's its proper title, though many people call it Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod. And I think that calls for a little music in back of it, don't you, Rachel?
Yes, I do. Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod one night sailed off in a wooden shoe, sailed on a river of crystal light into a sea of dew. Where are you going and what do you wish? The old moon asked the 3. We've come to fish for the herring fish that live in this beautiful sea. Nets of silver and gold have we, said Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod. The old moon laughed and sang a song as they rocked in the wooden shoe. And the wind that sped them all night long ruffled the waves of dew. The little stars were the herring fish that lived in that beautiful sea. Now cast your nets wherever you wish, but never afeard are we. So cried the stars to the fishermen 3, Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod.
I'm sorry to stop it without playing you the entire poem, but I see the time is getting late, and I wanted to give you a taste of Rachel Field's voice, which I think is absolutely charming. And what I'd like to finish with before I open this up to question is I wanted to make the point that the thing that really struck me about this whole wonderful odyssey that I've been on is that I feel that I gained one of my dearest friends in my life, even though we never got to meet. I feel like we traded gifts. My gift to Rachel was my determination to bring her light back to the world. And she did so much more for me. She transformed my writing life. This Rachel project has given me so much more confidence And in many ways, she also validated the circuitous path that I took to getting to the world of being a writer, because of the value she put on motherhood. I don't think I ever even got into the fact that she did have infertility issues, but did eventually adopt a child, to her great delight, and then sadly died when the child was only 2 years old. So so that was part of the many tragic elements of her sudden death. But she brought so much light to the world, and my hope is that in reading this book, people will be uplifted by her her optimism, by her wonderful recognition of the beauty of all aspects of life in the world. My favorite quote that I've read in a reviewer, Alan Adams, who wrote a review about the Fieldhouse, he said, "Before I read this book, I had never known Rachel Field, and now I'll never forget her." And I can think of no better reaction than that. Thank you. I would love to hear your questions, and I'm sorry I rambled on for quite so long.
No, I could certainly have listened to you ramble on much longer. This has been such an amazing introduction to Rachel Field. And I'm going to admit, I got very emotional listening to you talk about her, because it is so tangible. What a connection you have with your subject matter for this book. I take this moment to please invite folks, if you joined us a little late after I explained this at the beginning, you can go ahead and type your questions for Robin into the chat box. Also, if you would like to be unmuted, we don't have a ton of people here tonight, so we can do that. If you would like to be unmuted, you can also, and just ask your question aloud, you can also just type that into the chat box, and I'll locate you and unmute you. We had many people, Robin, who wrote when they were requesting the link to the program tonight, that they had just read your book or they were in the process of reading your book. So I look forward to anyone who would like to talk to Robin about their experience reading the book. I'll start real quickly. So you have a very unique circumstance in that you essentially live with a ghost. You, unlike most people, know so much about the person who lived in the place where you live, before you. It's a very special and unusual circumstance. Have you had that, does that spur conversation with other people who have perhaps lived in famous people's homes, or can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. That's a very cool question. One of the first things that comes to mind, that having written the book, has helped me find some of those people. A woman wrote to me who has spent many summers in the house that Ruth Moore lived in on Gott's Island, which was one of Rachel Field's favorite places to visit, right around, right nearby, near the Cranberries. And so yes, there was that woman. I met other writers who have been called by the same kind of the same kind of call from someone from the past. Sometimes it's their grandparents, sometimes it's a relative, and sometimes it's just a personage from the past who lived in an old house, and they get intrigued with digging up the history. Yeah, I think it's not as uncommon as you might think.
Well, it sounds like, you would develop a kinship with these folks who, again, have also lived in places where they've been able to discover information about the people who were there before them. I just think that's really special. I know nothing about the people who lived in the house where I am. Well, to follow up with that, Brenda asks, do you feel that you have ever received an answer from Rachel to any of your letters, and then she puts in parentheses, in a spiritual way?
Yes, I love that question. And I struck, so when I had that first writing prompt, I think the first thing that came out when I wrote Dear Rachel in 2016, I think I wrote, Dear Rachel, are you mad at me? That line didn't end up in the book, but I really did worry that maybe she wouldn't approve of me revealing some of these things about her life. the more time I spent with it, and the more time I spent, in her house, and just trying to tap into what she would have wanted, the more I believe deeply that she would have celebrated this this honesty, and having her life seen for everything that it was, including her being, I mean, before the surgery that ended up leading to her death, she said to a friend, well, I'll probably, see you at home in a few days and everything's going to be great. Things happen for a reason. I mean, that she just was that kind of person.
Oh, I think that every biographer probably has to grapple with that sense of would the person I'm writing about approve, and would they really want everything exposed? But yeah, I imagine that must be a difficult thing as you navigate all the various resources that you had, picking and choosing what parts you were going to use to tell the story. Diane asks, did the field house remain uninhabited after Rachel's death?
No, in fact, to my dismay, she did sell it before she died. When she went through her adoption, she could not leave California for a year, and her mother and aunt were getting older, and accessing the island was difficult because there was boat and there was a long walk, and they were getting a little elderly. And like everything in her life, she said, well, everything has its season, and it's come time to, to move forward and let the island go. But she wanted a friend to have it, and she did end up selling it to some people that she knew, but it was largely uninhabited. The people she sold it to weren't there much. They ended up having renters use it for many years. I think that guy left it to his godson who lived in Scotland and wasn't there a lot. And so there were renters there for years, kind of some who didn't treat it very well. And then it had been empty for 8 years before we bought it.
You had mentioned visiting other homes of hers in California.
Yeah.
Have any of them been turned into museums or historic homes designated for
No.
the purpose of remembering her?
No. And she's buried in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which is where her childhood was. But no, that she moved around several different homes in Hollywood and didn't live in any of them for terribly long. So they were passing.
Now, did you say that the Historical Society and the Cranberry Isles, have they done anything to kind of create almost a little museum to her at all?
Yeah, well, they have a whole museum of the region, and there's a corner dedicated to Rachel and Hitty. So
Okay.
there's Hitty dolls, there's Rachel Field books, there's there's a phenomenal archive. In fact, Bruce Commuson, who was one of the movers and shakers who founded all that Rachel Field stuff, is the one who provided that radio recording for me. Sadly, he did not live to see the book.
As far as her family, I mean, you mentioned again that she died so young. Who did she leave behind, and did they make any, I mean, I don't want you to give away all the secrets because I want people to read your book, but I'm just curious, are there any descendants left that you've communicated with, any relatives?
No descendants. Her father died when she was a baby. She and her sister were the only two of the 5 children to survive to adulthood. Neither of them ever had a child, and Rachel's adopted daughter did not live to have children.
Oh, that was a question that Marcy asked. What happened to the adopted daughter?
Yeah, she died quite young too, which was just yet another tragedy. And Rachel's husband never remarried, and so I actually, to find a relative to give me permission to access her medical records was a complicated job.
It sounds like it. Well, this is a great question to end on. Brenda asks, will you continue to write letters to Rachel?
Oh, I love that. You know what? I should finish. I should write her a wrap-up letter. In fact, maybe this weekend next weekend I'm going to a poetry retreat, and I'm bringing all of my Rachel Field books because I'm supposed to write an article about Rachel Field and her poetry. So I'm really happy to immerse in that, and that might give me an opportunity to reconnect with her.
Thank you so much for, I mean, this is such a gift, this writing of this book, to Rachel, to her memory, and, you know, to all of us, to help us remember this, you know, woman who just seems so talented and charismatic. And, you know, I really look forward to getting my hands on the book myself. And I want to just mention that. So it's available everywhere. Is that correct?
Yes, and the first print run sold out. So there was this month when no one could get the book except on Amazon. But now I believe you should be able to order it from any place that sells books. They can order it for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Go to your local bookstores and see if you can
Yes,
get through them.
and so many thanks to you, Julia, and to Camden Public Library for hosting this event. Your efforts during the pandemic have been wonderful, and I'm honored to be here with you.
My pleasure. And, you know, if you ever want to come back, Robin, let me know. I'm happy to have you. This has been such a treat and such a joy. Thank you to everyone who came out tonight. And I remind you, we do this sort of thing all the time. You can always find out about upcoming events by visiting librarycamden.org. Everyone is always welcome. And definitely visit Robin Clifford Wood's website too, and keep tabs on what she's up to. And people can follow you on social media.
Yep, I've got a Facebook page. I've got a Twitter feed that's not very active. Mostly Facebook is where and some Instagram. So my website is the best place to find your way.
Okay, super.
RobinCliffordWood.com.
There we go. RobinCliffordWood.com. Robin, thank you so much for joining us, and I wish you a wonderful rest of your evening. Good night to everyone.
Good night.